Hi, this is Kent Morlan, my friend Ray Pearcey. We're here for our Saturday session where we talk about stuff that we've run into in the last week. And I got into two pieces today. One on the Michael Smirkani show where they were talking about homelessness. And homelessness has gotten to where it's kind of a big deal. It's a huge problem. Major metropolitan areas, San Francisco, New York, mayor of New York is on a tear about wanting to basically take homeless people into custody, I guess.
Well,
And
he claims that he wants to take people that are notably disturbed into custody.
well, watch out, right?
Well, you know,
Or me
there it
too.
is.
Of course,
That is the problem.
and we had a conversation with a guy yesterday who came in here to talk to me about a problem he had with the district court, the DA's office that dated back to 2006, and absent his mother taking care of him, he would probably be homeless.
Well, he's
His,
exhibit A of the difficulty. I mean, his claim was that his initial big encounter with the cops was that he had called them or had his mother call and they showed up
and then
uh,
they attacked him.
and they attacked him. And he went downhill rapidly as a consequence
Yeah,
of it.
well, they charged him with assaulting a police officer in June of 2006. And on July the 7th, with counsel, he pleads no contest and gets sentenced to 7 years in a state penitentiary.
It's a nightmare. It would be a nightmare for somebody with, pretty good mental health, and it's a bigger nightmare for somebody who already has problems with authority and the rest of it, which is manifest in his
But
case.
what was crazy about it, they ended up sending him to Veneta. He spent 11 months in a psychiatric unit in Veneta, Oklahoma. He never actually went to prison, although they had him in Tulsa County Jail, I think, for a month. So this guy gets wound up with the cops, and they, for 7 years this went on with this poor schmuck. And of course, I go down to the Quick Trip at 15th and Denver here in Tulsa, and while I don't see the same people every day, I see a lot of the same people over a period of time because I go there fairly frequently. I see an awful lot of people there. There's one guy, for example, who stands out, who's in a wheelchair and has no legs. He asked me for something to eat one day, and under my ethics, I cannot refuse to feed somebody who says he's hungry. And I won't give people money just for asking for it, but if they say they're hungry, I have an obligation in my mind to say, what do you want? I get them a hamburger or a cheeseburger or a hot dog or something to eat and something to drink, and I pay for it. I had a guy approach me on the street here one time, said he wanted something to eat, and the closest place was a Chinese place that's opened up over there in the 201 West Fifth Street building. It took him cost me $20 buy lunch for him.
Well, he probably appreciated it, Ken. I mean, it's like it's a problem with multiple dimensions because many of the people who are on the street are there voluntarily. That is, they don't want to be in a structured space under nominal supervision, and in part it's their outlook. Another part of it surely is their mental state.
But they'd rather sleep outside than sleep in a shelter unless the conditions are so
True.
harsh that they're driven inside.
Awful, right? And I mean, you might elucidate our viewers on how all of this evolved, but it's like in New York City, the mayor there is proposing to use the police force to round up people who appear to be uh, problematic. And this will be a change because the old rule had been somebody who's manifestly a danger to themselves or others.
Well, let's say that you're living in a tent sitting on a subway grate. And the reason they sleep on subway grates is when the trains go through, air blows up from
Sure, it's
inside the
warm.
subway and it's warm, right?
Right.
So if you're in New York City and you're going to freeze to death if you don't do anything else, you lay down on a subway grate or go into the subway itself. And I suppose if you pay one, get on a subway train, you can ride a subway train all night. They probably
Well,
have people do that.
yeah, they're called yo-yos. I think New York City has outlawed that, but it's a practice still.
Well, I was in New York City with a guy from Claremore, a guy named Bill Higgins. We were up there on a case on the opposite sides, and they were staying just off of Central Park South, and I was staying at Helmsley. And I said, "Well, I'll take you guys out to dinner tonight." So I went over and picked them up, and we got on the N train or something that went down toward the seaport in the southern part of the island of Manhattan. And we hadn't any more gotten on the train. Some blind guy comes along begging money. So we have dinner, and then we come up out of the restaurant and he said, "We're going to ride the train back." And I said, "No, we're going to take a cab back at 9 o'clock at night." And I actually walked across Manhattan with a bunch of German engineers one night over to the World Trade Center. We stayed there. And I thought it was dangerous as hell to walk across Manhattan in the middle of the night. But we didn't have any trouble. And I've never really had any trouble in New York City with the homeless. And I have never had any trouble with the homeless in Tulsa.
And it's a good point because most homeless people, if the data, the standing data is any indication, are not dangerous. They're not violent people. There are obviously exceptions to that.
Well, I've been down here 45 years, more or less. Came back here in 1976. So what does that make? 46 years?
Mm-hmm.
I've been here 46 years. I've worked downtown for 46 years. I have never, ever had one problem in downtown Tulsa. And I've been out on the streets in the middle of the night, right? I've had servers go offline, just get up at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, walk from the house over to the office, reset the server, and go back. Never even see anybody. Right?
Well, I mean, my experience has been pretty much the same.
And you've had more trouble with the cops than you've had with homeless
people. I have, and it's part of the, it's part of the equation.
Well, you're guilty of walking while black. Is your
right.
problem.
And it's like
that's true. That's true. He has problems because the cops stop him and interrogate him all the time, as like he's a suspect in some armed robbery somewhere.
Well, let's push back on all the time, but it happens with alarming frequency. I will say that, and we're again talking from downtown Tulsa, which is not a place that one associates with excessive violence and chaos.
Yeah, for the information of anybody who's watching this, Ray lives in the Greenwood area, the historic where the riot occurred in 1921.
And I walk back and forth to various places in the downtown.
And I live in the southwest quadrant of downtown.
And have for the whole time that you've been in town.
I've lived, except for the first 2 or 3 years after I came back to Tulsa in '76, I have lived in or very close to downtown. And I've lived in an apartment for 20 years at 7th and Denver.
And I mean,
problem.
you've talked about this before. Part of the problem here and elsewhere with homeless folks is a perception problem. People have the perception that they're dangerous when in fact they aren't. But perceptions are powerful. They're powerful in politics and they're powerful in practice. And there are instances.
They're forms of fantasy is what it
right. Well, for some people. And there are instances, I guess of late, particularly in New York City, where homeless people have done disastrous things.
Well, they're not any different than anybody else. A really very small percentage of them. First of all, what kind of a person who's in the right mind commits murder? Well, they're mentally ill. You have to be mentally ill to commit murder, right? In my opinion. Now, that doesn't mean that you don't know the difference between right or wrong, but you have certainly severely impaired judgment. And people who are schizophrenic have a severely impaired judgment, and there is a risk, I suppose.
Well, let me ask you about the history of all of this. I mean, there was an earlier period, arguably we could say much of American recent history until maybe the 50s or something, was a period where protections for somebody who was exhibiting odd behavior, who was on the street or roaming around, protections were minimal. I mean, they could be picked up, and the next thing you knew, you were in a loony bin.
Well, there was a
But
guy.
all of that was changed, though,
Right.
in the
Well,
60s, right?
there was a guy in my hometown named Othel Gibbs who was schizophrenic. He was a musician. He could play a piano or a horn.
Talented guy.
Well, in fact, it was said that his horn was on the bed and he slept on the floor. Right? And periodically he'd get too out of control, and they'd come pick him up and take him over to the state hospital in Nevada, Missouri, where they'd keep him for a time. And the United States Supreme Court said they couldn't do that. So the states were yippies. I just opened the doors to loony bins.
So that was like a signal case.
Yeah, they just let them all out, right? Okay, well, if you can't keep, if they're not a danger to themselves or somebody else, you can't hold them. So they just turned all these people loose, and they just went out on the streets, And when I was serving on the Morton Clinic Board in 1987 to 1991, they do the inventories of the homeless on the coldest night of the year, or what they think will be the coldest night, because it drives the homeless off the streets, right?
Mm-hmm.
They have to go inside or they're liable to freeze to death. And they go in and they count them. And there's about 900 to 1,000 homeless people in Tulsa at any given time, which is a small percentage of the population. 400,000 people here. And you got 1,000, 1/400th of the population is so mentally ill that they don't have a place to live. And yet we can't seem to come up with a way to take care of these people. And one of the things that was said on the Smirkani show this afternoon on CNN, he said, we take better care of cats and dogs in this country than we take care of the homeless.
Yeah, and there's surely something to that. I think some of it, though, goes to the schizophrenic attitude that we have.
Even the general population is schizophrenic about the homeless population?
Yes. What an irony. So, it's like, is it okay just to round up people who may or may not be a nuisance but are problematic and induce anxiety among people who are walking
Well,
around?
I would hope. Let's say that the weather forecast for tonight was 0. Tulsa doesn't happen very often. Let's say 10 degrees. I think that the cops ought to just go out and round up anybody they can find that's on the street and take them and put them someplace where it's warm for the night.
Well, the problem is that some people won't want to go. And what do you do about that?
You could take them into custody. I mean, the cops have the power to do that. I mean, I can be walking down the street, and they could come up with probable cause to stop me and drag my ass off to David L. Moss and keep me there overnight. They could accuse me of something, being ugly.
Well, see, herein lies the problem. It's like
you resemble that white guy that did that bad thing this afternoon.
So I'm taking you in. Yeah. Well, it's like, where do we go with this, though? I mean, you'll remember that there was a big effort, successful one, in the early '60s to abolish all of these big public psychiatric facilities, because they were filled with, according to people who had been in them and investigators and academics who looked at it and public policy people, they were just warehousing people.
Well, you know where the word Bedlam came from.
Mm-hmm.
Bedlam was an insane asylum in London, and it was crazy inside. They just literally chained naked people to the wall.
And while it was an
Feed 'em.
extreme case, there were many other instances where people were restrained and living conditions were terrible. And
Or the the Quakers were big movers and shakers in bringing more humane treatment to the homeless and the insane in England. And
and I think they played a similar role here. But so all of those big facilities, Veneta being the
well,
central
it's
one
still
here,
open. That's where this guy that we talked to used to. That's where they sent him.
but it's
11 months.
It's like a tiny fraction of what it was, right?
Yeah.
And it may be the only facility of that kind.
Well, the largest and second largest mental institutions in the state of Oklahoma today are the Oklahoma County Jail and the Tulsa County Jail.
And the state prison facilities, whatever they are.
Big Mac is full of crazy people, crazy as hell.
Exactly.
By and large.
So, there was this movement to abolish these big facilities, which succeeded in the main. And so there's no place to send somebody often. And I imagine at Veneta there's a waiting list.
Well, if you're going to be sent up there for a psychiatric examination, you're going to be held in the Tulsa County Jail until and they charge that guy $250 in transportation fees.
Thank you very much.
They sent him a bill for taking him to Veneta, and then sent him a bill for coming and getting him back.
This poor fellow, who appeared to be a nice person, had a fixation on the fact that every time he was abused by the authorities, he got a bill for his trouble.
Well, and this is how goofy sometimes people are. Every county in Oklahoma uses similar. For example, CF 2006 1000 can be a Tulsa County number or an Oklahoma County number or a Cleveland County number. They're all exactly alike.
These are case numbers.
Case numbers. The only way you can tell the difference is look and see which docket you're looking at.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he got it in his head that the state was trying to collect taxes from him because he was looking at an Oklahoma County docket sheet on a completely different case. Now, so this guy, fortunately for him, his mother's still alive, and as long as she's still alive, he'll probably be okay. But the reality is we've got an awful lot of people on the street in this town in this kind of weather who are sleeping outside in tents. It's obviously possible to sleep in a tent in very bad weather outside because they do it on Mount Everest all the time. But you got to have the right kind of clothes, right?
Well, you do, and these are very tangible and important problems. But and I don't want to obsess on this, Kent, but it all goes back to the origins of this guy's problem. I mean, he was minding it. In fact, he was being a good Samaritan. He had his mom call the cops.
Because he claimed that there were some young men that were attacking a neighbor. So he asked his mother to call the cops. Cops come, and instead of dealing with that problem, they arrest him and take him to jail.
Exactly. And this is like, in this society, in this town and elsewhere, is it the case that we want to use the cops to do this kind of work? Because it's like it traumatizes the very people that are at the core of the dilemma.
Okay, I read an article last week, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal again, said that we know how to reduce crime in our society. And what it is, it's community policing, more involvement in psychiatric social workers and people to help people get jobs, make money, make livings for themselves. And they said, first of all, the cops know exactly where the crime occurs. It's pockets. They have a statistical model of where the next murders.
Concentrated. Huh? Very concentrated.
Oh yeah, little bitty areas. And for example, Ray and I have a friend named Drew Diamond, who was the chief of police in Tulsa 30 years ago, thereabouts. And Drew was too liberal. Although he had been in the Tulsa Police Department for a long time, he got internally promoted to be the chief of police, and he was an advocate for what is called community policing. And what community policing is the cops get their asses out of the cars and they go in the stores and they
They
go to
interact with people.
yeah, and they go to churches and they go in and they introduce themselves and they give out their cards and say, if you have a problem, give me a call, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the Tulsa policemen didn't like it and they ran his ass off.
Well, they revolted, and
He's
despite
running the Jewish community center down.
actually he's retired.
Yes.
Hmm. Yeah, I saw him a few.
Real
Couple weeks
nice
ago.
guy, and he left Tulsa and he did community policing in Jamaica, which is
Yeah, it's a national, even international.
yeah, terrible crime problem in Kingston, Jamaica. And they went down there and changed the way the cops operated and apparently significantly reduced the crime in that town.
Well, exactly, but I have to say that part of our problem here is that a hell of a lot of the street crime and violent crime in America is not committed by people that we would characterize as mentally ill folks. They're professionals, and they're mostly younger people. They're predatory people. There aren't very many of them. And so you've got the homeless here, and you've got this other group of people, and there's some overlap.
Well,
But
who's the most likely victim of violence in the United States? A woman who is beaten up or killed by her husband, boyfriend. That's the vast majority.
of the domestic,
If
truly
you know,
horrendous crimes, yes.
I see it all the time, publishing stuff on Moore Law. You know, domestic A and B by strangulation. These guys throttle. They get these women by the neck and they choke them, or they kill them. They hit them too hard. I'm representing a young woman right now that her boyfriend, father of her three children, threw her through a window and broke her leg.
Well,
She also shot off a warning shot with a pistol earlier this year, which the cops took away from her. Unfortunately, they didn't charge her with a felony for shooting her weapon inside the city limits. They've got the gun, and I can get it back for her in 2 years if they don't charge her. But she was afraid of him because he had just slapped her around.
well, I mean, domestic abuse is a huge problem, and it accounts for vast.
But most people who
Volume
kill
of
somebody
stuff.
kill somebody they know. Once
That's
in a
right.
while, you will have somebody kill a stranger. That happened a couple of years ago here, where they had a pizza delivery guy was killed by a couple of guys. Of course, they caught him and they're in prison now.
Well,
But
you've also got this category of enterprise-related killings, mostly dealing, drug
that's
dealing stuff.
drug disputes,
Right, exactly, and that's a significant fraction
Well, the war on
of what
drugs,
we've got.
he and I agree. The war on drugs, if it's a war, which is not, we lost. And for example, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal today about meth addiction, and the subject of the article was a young woman who was a military wife, and a friend introduced her to cocaine, and she went square to hell on it. Basically, ended up in prison eventually, got out. It says she straightened her life up, and she's now, got a new guy, and a couple of new kids, and all that stuff. But she's at risk of falling off of that wagon at any given time. And the article said in 2010, they said that there were 1,300 and some odd people died from cocaine-related deaths in the United States, and the number in 2020 was 33,000. So we're doing the wrong direction.
Well, we are, and some of it is, predatory behavior on the part of pharmaceutical firms made a hell of a lot.
Well, that
of
was the
sense.
opioid thing,
Yeah.
and there's
Right.
70,000 people at least died from opioid overdoses last year, and some people say that's an underestimate.
Undercount.
But
Yeah.
a lot of the, there's a certain percentage of people that are on the street are there because of drug abuse, and it's fried their brains, and they're not functioning very well. But I would say the vast majority of the people on the street are basically mentally ill. They're not drug abusers. They may
Well,
be they may be mentally ill people who use
yeah, I
drugs
think
or
these aren't
smoke a little
exclusive
weed now and then, you know.
categories, right? And some of them have been. I mean, there's an appreciable fraction who are veterans,
I agree with that.
and
A lot of
so
them are
and
post-traumatic stress disorder people.
exactly. So you've got these subpopulations,
I
and
was approached by a guy at Quick Trip last night or the night before. I wear this Air Force hat. He said, "Hey, you're in the Air Force, man. I was Army." You know, and they gave me his, the code for what he did. He probably wanted money, but I wasn't a good hit for him, so he went on. But a lot of the guys, a lot of the men that I see on the street are ex-Army. They've been in the military,
right,
most of
right.
them. And the Army and the Marine Corps produces the most post-traumatic stress disorder. Navy and the Air Force, it's kind of hard to be stressed out when you have three squares and bunk every night. And nobody ever shoots at you.
Well, I hope we
That was
don't get
my
any
military.
feedback
That was
from
my military
any
experience.
veterans on this, but that sounds right to me.
Well, okay, so we were talking about what do you do, and I have in my head that I could take let me say, I lived in a 1050 trailer in law school for 3 years. Perfectly okay place to live. I could take a shipping container, a 40-foot shipping container, and turn it into an apartment for somebody, and it would be perfectly adequate. It would have a kitchen, it would have a shower, it would have a bathroom, it would have a stool, and it would have a bedroom and a living room, right? And it would have skylights and all kinds of stuff. I mean, and it probably cost $10,000 to build it. That's a wag. You know what a wag is? Wild ass guess. I think for $10,000 I could make these units.
Well,
So for $1 million I could build a house for every homeless person in the city, right?
I think
Uh,
we've got three problems. One is
the people,
America's.
the citizens of the city of Tulsa.
That's right, and the citizens elsewhere. They're averse to housing that doesn't look identical to what they're living in. We've got the primacy of single family dwelling zones and preferences all over the place. And we've got, we've got politicians who are highly responsive to that NIMBY, this
Well,
problem.
yeah,
And,
not
and
my NIMBY is not in my backyard.
right,
And I was in San Diego many years ago, I don't know, 30 years ago maybe, and they were having a big dispute in San Diego because San Diego was building a facility in downtown San Diego to provide goods and services to the homeless, and they were fearful that they were going to make San Diego too attractive to the homeless, so the people in LA would move down to San Diego because it's a better place to live, right? I don't know if it happened or not.
well, I mean, California's the poster child for
But
housing
but
problems.
but let's say you could actually find a place to put 1,000 housing units. These shipping containers modified to be a place for people to live, right? And you could get the homeless to, in fact, live in them. Hopefully, they wouldn't look too much like jail cells. But let's say you get the homeless to live in them. The biggest problem would be where do you find a place where you could actually put these that the neighbors wouldn't throw a hissy fit about it?
Well, it's a huge problem. I mean, and there are European countries we could name and other places that are well ahead of us on this front.
But you have to spend money. It's expensive.
Well, it's like the containerization thing. Modular housing is less expensive than conventional
Well,
housing.
I have a woman that works for me who lives on North Harvard, and across the street from it, she lives in a Catholic Charities facility up there. Works for me on Saturday and Sunday. And across the street is a little trailer park, right?
Mm-hmm.
And people are living in these little bitty camper trailers. I mean they're smaller than the room that we're in, and people live in them because they stuff all of the stuff that they need. They got a bed, they got a kitchen, they got a bathroom, and they have a television set and internet access maybe. But so if you really put this together, you say, okay, we're going to better train the cops so that they're better equipped to deal with mental illness. Two, we're going to hire some people who are trained in sociology and psychiatric services,
Mm-hmm.
and we're going to spend more money to try to get people who are capable of being settled down and get jobs. You know, the Zero family in Tulsa has this Home First plan where they just go in and buy an apartment house and they pluck homeless people, psych people mentally ill, and they put them in an apartment. And they have a manager of the apartment house who is a social worker who makes sure they get their drugs, get them cleaned up, get them the clothes, get them a job, right? Help them out. And that, but it's, you know, the Zeros don't have enough money because it's expensive. But if you did that, if you did the three deals with the cops, and then you give people a place to live, you first of all you reduce crime, you reduce homelessness, you make the place a better place to live. But I don't see that the people who run this city will ever come up with the money to do it. Do you?
Well,
So we're just
I
blowing
don't know.
smoke. Are we just blowing smoke here?
No, well, it's like, see, I don't think there's a problem. It's all a problem, as you're alluding to, of political will and priorities. And it's like, the container stuff, the cargo stuff.
I could draw up a plan for one of these in 5 minutes.
Well, see, the problem, the reality though is, can't there there's thousands of square feet of underutilized or not utilized at all office and commercial spaces in this town that will never be used for anything that has any economic utility that could be used tomorrow to house
The owners of these
places.
buildings are not going to do it.
Well,
First of all,
they'd have to be compensated.
well, but you also, for example, I had an office in the Beacon building, 11,000 square foot, 27 offices, and I actually had somebody staying there, living there a time or two. Ricky Watts was an example.
But
And
so
the owner didn't. You were there for a time too, and
well,
they didn't like it where the dam.
Well, the city, this city, and any other city could subsidize.
You can't live in those buildings.
Well, you could.
Fire regulations.
Modified.
Fire regulations.
They won't cost less to modify them to build new spaces.
Well, they want to turn these buildings into yuppie flats, right? Which they've done in several buildings downtown. They take them and they just subdivide them into apartments and they rent them to people. And so they're not interested in renting them to mentally ill people.
Well, it's like mentally ill people are no more destructive on average than other people.
I'm not sure I'd agree with that.
Well, there's a lot of data on this, man. A lot of data.
You know, I once had a lawsuit over an apartment complex construction case. 435 apartments in 38 buildings, and we did a survey of all 435 of them. You go into one apartment, it looked pristine, man. They go next door, and it looked like a bomb had gone off in it, you know. And I know people that live where I live that it's hot. They live in a hovel inside a building. I mean,
well, that was the point I was going to make. You don't have to be mentally ill or modest income to be a messy slob and to create chaos all around.
Okay, well, we've been talking for 33 minutes, which is probably enough on this subject. But what I see is the condition today will be the condition tomorrow, which will be a condition a year from now, and be a condition for 10 years from now, because the American people are not willing to tell their political leaders to deal with it. Is that a fair characterization?
I think that's as likely as anything else, although I'm a little bit more optimistic. I mean, these are if people really are concerned about this, obviously they would like a solution.
But you don't think, well, Adams is trying to do something about it in New York, and you're critical of Adams. You say, well, he's got to.
Well, I just don't, and we can talk about this on a later show, but I just don't know if the police are the best vehicle for animating a project like this.
Where are you going to get 35,000 people to look out for
You
this.
don't need 35.
Well, I know, but the city of New York has
They have
35,000 cops.
35,000 cops.
And they got the cars, and they got the authority, and they got all of this stuff. You know, and that's just the regular cops. When you add the subway guys and the transit guys and all that stuff, who knows how many cops there are in New York?
I would warrant that you could create a force with a tiny fraction of all of those resources and resolve many of these problems.
Maybe so. We'll see. Have a nice day. Talk to you in a week or so.